this week's God Squad Upfront. Here's where we discuss big issues and trending topics. If you're ready, so are we.
Today we have Kay Brown, who is a social justice organizer and commissioner on the Criminal Justice Advisory Commission and Police Community Review Board. Kay is a founding member and steering committee member of Guilford for All. Thank you so much for being with us, Kay. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We have Katie, who has dialed in today. She's going to be joining us via phone connection. Kate, can you, and Kalila, can you talk a little bit about why we are featuring Kay this week? And it sounds like you're doing some really important stuff in Guilford County. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Okay, so I am a social justice organizer that I also dabble in some elections work, mainly local elections around like county, city council, school board, things of that nature. I'm really about building grassroots change and pipelining new leaders into these spaces and getting new voices heard so that we can move progress forward and changing the face of what being progressive looks like in the state of North Carolina.
You know, that's I think the one thing that has happened in the past few days is this what it seems like the voter suppression campaign. And I think that scares me a lot because I think that the vote is so important that it will determine the future of the voice of minorities. And the more votes that we get cast, the more power it means. Really, it contributes to what a democracy really looks like. And so I really think that your work is so important, and we have got to make sure that votes are counted. And in the last election, when they started talking about votes being flipped, I got scared because we got lucky that phone call in Georgia was taped. What if it wasn't? And we don't know were the other ones flipped or not. So we've got to keep our eyes open, and we got to get to the polls. So I'm really glad that you're doing this work. And North Carolina is really, really important that the votes of all people are counted. Go ahead, Kate.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the progress that we all want to see, like it bothers me that we still have babies in cages. It bothers me that we had a president that called Black countries shithole countries. It bothers me that we still haven't gotten economic equity, justice, reparations, or anything else for descendants of slavery. A lot of these things bother me, and so much so that I'm like, okay, if I feel this way, who else around me is feeling and seeing the same things that I'm feeling? And what are the ways can we start to pipeline and encourage and like develop people to be able to go in and build winning campaigns? When we look at what being a Democrat means in the South, it honestly leaves a lot to be desired. And what I found in the last election was it was more fear and more of there's a certain type of oppression that people of color have gotten used to. And it's like, can we at least get back to that? Like the fear that it can get worse instead of actually seeing how things can get better and how things should be better and how things should be equitable, I think has been defining what the blue wave could look like across the South. And I think that outside of a few places, we did not see a blue wave. When we look at North Carolina, Roy Cooper at the top couldn't deliver for Sherry Beasley, couldn't deliver. Wayne Goodwin didn't even win the insurance commissioner. When you looked at a lot of the county commission races across the state, red sweeps. You look at a lot of the municipal races, red sweeps, with the exception of these strongholds, that even with those being Democratic strongholds, we still didn't see a wave of progressive candidates that came out of it. So when we look at where's your AOCs, where are your Ayanna Presleys, where are your Bernie Sanders? Like, where are those people who are actually speaking to larger, like factions of people across the country? Why isn't that translating into votes? And I really think that part of that comes from people just not actually feeling like change is realistic, because there's a certain level of oppression that we think is just inherent to the American experience. And one of the things that I've really fought against is pulling people, or fight for, is to pull people out of those norms, and to see that there are some things that can happen, that should happen, and that makes America better when it does happen. So for example, when we talk and have conversations around immigration, sometimes even in Black communities, it's like, well, people take our jobs. It's like, okay, the exploitation of rich, wealthy people is what's driving down the wages. And that's holding back your level of career progression, where my grandparents could graduate from high school, go get a job at a factory, make good wages, work there their whole lives, get a pension, come out and feel like they're taken care of, get access to health care and everything else. But when you look at, for a millennial, me, Social Security probably isn't going to be there. The cost of childcare is literally what some of us actually make. When you look at the cost of student loans, it's absolutely ridiculous right now, but the wages haven't actually kept up. When you look at things like Black maternal health crisis, even though we have all of these advances in medical care, as a Black woman, even with a master's degree, I'm still more likely to die in childbirth than you, Maureen. And it just doesn't matter. But like how these things play out, we need to start speaking more to what's possible and get people out of, it can get worse, so let's just deal with what we have to deal with because it can get worse from here. But we actually need to start challenging people to move past that point, because we can't give people health care. We can't treat Black men equitably when they're pulled over by the police. That doesn't mean that people just get to commit crimes and everybody's going to run amok. It means that there should be equity in the system, that regardless of how much you make, regardless of your race, gender, ethnicity, orientation, how you identify, you should be treated with respect as a human. And those used to be, well, I won't even say used to be, but the Jesus I know, or the God that I know, believes in equity, believes in fairness, and believes in loving one another, and not actually in perpetuating the oppression of others to make yourself feel better. So it was probably a lot to say that that's how I view my work in the South. Like, being progressive is not a white northern thing. It is not an academic thing. It's not some ivory tower intellectual thing. It's basically coming down and saying, you deserve fair wages, and we actually can obtain that. You deserve actual health care. We should, like, there was a child I saw on Instagram, $2.1 million for treatment, and the parents are out trying to get life-saving care for their kids. You got people dying trying to ration insulin, something that's unheard of in other countries, but Mark Zuckerberg can get how many yachts, like, it's Elon Musk can fly to the moon and back and build a hotel there, but we can't even give kids insulin. We can't even make sure that kids have food when they go to school without shaming families that can't afford to pay that kind of money a month for those crappy meals that they get that are like jailhouse meals. Like, there are things that we should be doing that should not be the norm, that should be absolutely socially unacceptable. And if we're going to actually get wins on that, we have to start talking with Black folks in the South, immigrants in the South, like, just people just in general, poor people in general, white, Black, across the spectrum. So I came from a time where I did a lot of BLM activism and work. I also did things with the NAACP. I worked in a lot of spaces that were primarily Black American indigenous, well, not, well, I guess I won't say indigenous, but Black descendants of slavery. And over time, what I started to realize is all of these issues are not just Black issues. Some of these issues, other people also have skin in the game to help us get past. And our allies should feel tasked with not just going into our communities to lecture us on what we need to do and who we need to vote for every 4 years, but actually need to be out in their own communities speaking against the oppression and the racism and the discrimination that's happening across this country.
See, yeah, I think that's a major problem. I heard something after Asians were being attacked because of the terrible things that Trump started saying about Asian people, even when the movie won the Oscar. I mean, he said just really ignorant things about the movie winning the Oscar. So after the attacks in Los Angeles, one of the Asian representatives said that their people came here, and she said, we came here and we did not get welfare or food stamps. We made it on our own. And I was kind of offended by that statement because, yeah, Asian people came here, but Black people were brought here and made to work here and to be slaves and build up this country. So it doesn't make any difference how people survive being here. The fact that people are here and they've been grossly discriminated against puts them in the same boat. And so there is a reason to relate to each other. That relating to each other is based on discrimination, bigotry, based on the need and the will to survive. It doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. It's based on the fact that if you are in a class of people that's being treated like you're not a human being, then it's incumbent upon all of us to stand with that group. And even the majority should stand with that group if they believe in humanity, if they believe in democracy and what's just. You stand with what's right. And just like you were saying, I mean, we need to bridge that, put that link together. And you're right. It doesn't matter whether you're in a church, a mosque, or whatever it is, you got to start relating to each other.
So
and there have been, we talk about multiracial work and organizing and everyone coming together, but oftentimes what gets left out is we say people of color, which is like you have whites and then you have everybody else. But in actuality, everyone else isn't necessarily, doesn't identify with being lumped into each other. And the nature of white supremacy has been to pick and choose winners and losers, even amongst people in Black communities, where you have light skin versus dark skin. You have rich versus poor. You have, I can move out of these hoods and be away from these people, and I'm a different kind of person, so I should be treated different. You also have where I went to a school, a high school at the time, it was predominantly a white school. Even some of the things that were built around equity that should have been able to benefit me as a Black person that came from a lineage of slavery, when you look at other, I guess, minorities, like where Asian communities and things like that, when you talked about scholarships, when you talk about who got access to get into certain AP classes and things like that, even within who we would consider people of color, there were still people there that disproportionately benefited based on proximities to whiteness. And we don't talk about that always and how that shows up in other communities. So like even in the Latinx community, if you go down to Mexico, there are people who look like me that don't get treated fairly based on the hue of their skin tone. There are people in India that, based on how dark you are and what class of family you come to, you're not treated equitably and fairly. And we actually, in America, because we have this white Anglo-Saxon European, form of whiteness, and then there's everybody else, that doesn't actually speak to some of the other issues that we have, even amongst people of color. So it's kind of difficult, you know, to.
That's exactly right.
Lump people in.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers of privilege. We've talked a little bit about religious privilege on the God Squad up front. There's a lot of intersections, and you know, with the work that you're doing with regard to unity, one of the things that came up sort of in discussing this discussion was the role of corporate interests and in government agendas, and people who have class and socioeconomic power, in addition to their whiteness, in addition to their gender privilege. You know, there's a whole set of intersections of privilege. I guess, do you have any thoughts or strategies in the work that you're doing on how we get folks to undermine those corporate agendas and in their corruption of democratic goals and outcomes? There are more questions, but that's one of them.
Yeah. So one of the things that I actually have a corporate background as well, and I have seen the way that those things play out. So for example, I worked, I won't even drop the name of the company, but if you knew me, probably knew some of the stories of it, where that was considered a Fortune 500 company that did very well on diversity. But when you actually peel back the layers, most of the Black people were in the call centers, with the exception of a few. Most of the folks of Indian descent were in the IT departments. We had white women all up and down management, and we had a lot of white males in the positions that, even if they weren't managers, they were some of the most highest paid positions, like your accountants, your finance team, your project management team, and things like that. One of the things that I noticed is, unless you actually go through and truly unpack that, we say diversity and inclusion, but that is still based on a Caucasian white American standard of what professionalism is, on what does it look like to succeed. And even though we are cherry picking among communities to get different hues or different facial shapes or different eye shapes or different religious backgrounds, we still aren't actually diversifying the experiences. And the people who usually get promotions and get support are usually those folks that can share those backgrounds with those white people.
They subscribe to white supremacy culture. Yes.
Right. And it's like, you got to put your head down, get along, talk about your vacations, you know, do all of that stuff. And if you choose not to participate in what that looks like, then that hinders your career. We actually have to start leaning into those tensions and holding people responsible for that inside and outside. So we need to strengthen laws so that if it's not in a policy, like technically based on my hair in the state of North Carolina, I can be discriminated against if they don't like it. It's just something about it, it's just not professional. Regardless of whether or not I have an MBA, regardless of whether or not I've run this and that before, it's just my look doesn't fit the mold. If it's my dialect, my vernacular, maybe it's a little too urban and it just doesn't quite fit in, or I'm applying for something up north and I have a Southern drawl in it, so it makes me feel like, you know, make people feel like I'm not as smart. I think that we have to actually start holding hiring managers accountable for that, and actually training past that and getting people to understand implicit bias and the full way that that shows up. That's more than just a slide deck that they pull out of the cards every once in a while when they're about to get sued. That company actually had things so bad in that department. It's one of the most diverse and inclusive organizations that a white male was discriminated against because the preferences were to white women. The white women managers wanted to see themselves reflected in each cycle of management, top to bottom, with the exception of maybe the CEO and the person under the CEO, which were two white males. Everyone else under that was white women. You know, and it's like, we have to actually be real about not just checking boxes when it comes to diversity and inclusion, but actually taking it seriously and watching how does that happen with pay? how are we measuring people that are actually based on true qualifications and not just on how we feel about it? And are we firing managers that violate those practices and policies? We have to take that seriously up and down. And we have to start having kitchen table conversations and holding each other accountable for when we see that happen. So I'll say in my family, even though I'm Black, Black American, we've gone through a lot. And I'm from here in a rural place in the South, like where the Klan has been known to still have protests and go up and down the main streets. But when we start talking about things around immigration, where people just don't understand, or when we start talking about why are pronouns important and how does that make people feel safe, we still have to challenge each other to have those kinds of kitchen table conversations, because some people don't know until they've been exposed to it. And in white communities, I think that that's where a lot of the work actually has to happen, in white areas, in rural areas, in places where there just isn't a lot of diversity, and people challenging their families and those dynamics, and holding people accountable for how that shows up. That we have to have a culture change in America. That's not just.
Well, but it gets so deep, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Kay, but I know you're going to understand. You can look at it from the outside and the inside. You know how it is that people from white community and even sometimes from the Black community, you can get over because your features are not as African. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, your skin is not dark, your nose is not wide, your lips are what's considered normal. And so you're going to have advantages that someone else is not going to have. And white culture has trained the minds of so many people about what is acceptable and what isn't. And if you look at some of those old programs, they used to have them all the time where people would go into office and apply for jobs. And people are literally judged based on the hue of their skin. You can have two Black people go for a job, and maybe the one with darker skin is more qualified than the one with brown skin, but they will give that job to someone with lighter brown skin than dark Black skin. It's unbelievably socially negligent behavior that it becomes shocking and hurtful.
Yeah.
And what happens, it can become traumatizing. And you talk about inferiority complexes, it can build up inside someone psychologically, that it becomes damaging, not just to the individual, but to the whole, to the family situation. I mean, prejudice, it's more than just communal. It destroys the individual personality, the family, besides the community. And how to fix all of these levels that it affects.
And I can speak on that some, because I'm a person that, my pronouns are she, her, they, them. I'll go by any pronoun that's really just not he, him. But I still understand that there's a certain way that I present. Even when I do work that's primarily in Black spaces, and I'm working with people who maybe they're just getting introduced into movements, there are some males that find me attractive. And so some of the things that I say, it can be flip-flopped and reversed, but there's still a certain level of privilege that I've had going into some spaces, because some people just thought I was cute or attractive, or, oh, she looks so cute, like she smiles, she just must be nice and adorable, or, oh my gosh, can I ask questions about your hair? Because you look like really nice and you smile a lot and you don't look as intimidating as maybe some of those other Black people look. It's like we have so many intersections that go with it. There are times where I do have to show up and present, this is even though this is a thing for me too, let me not be the first one that hops up to go. And my experience is the same thing with body shaming, right? Where I am full figured plus size, but in ways that males and other people may find kind of attractive. So even though even though I'll say, well, I'll go out on the beach and I'll wear what I want to wear, I'm still being cognizant of other people who don't have the same shape as me. How are you talking to them and how are you treating them? And to let people know, just because you picked me as a favorite in that moment on that intersection doesn't make it okay that you treat other people this way because you think that that doesn't impact. That's trash. You're not going to get support from me on discriminating against that person either, regardless of what your other intersections are. And I think that that's something that we have to start normalizing. Not that it's a cancel culture, but sometimes I actually have to walk people through it's not just that I organize with people who already agree with me. Most of the people I'll be surrounded with are actually people who maybe they voted for Trump. Maybe they're white and I might be one of the only Black folks that they've had interactions with. There was once a time where I was like, I'm emotionally so exhausted from racism, I don't feel like carrying anybody. But as a person who says that I want to be a leader in social justice movements, I have to be moving people along an arc of understanding where I can, because it's through that development, through that pushing, through those culture shifts, that actual transformational change can start to happen.
That's
I'm
really
laughing. I'm
neat.
sorry. I wasn't I was laughing because my daughter said when I answered the phone the other day, she goes, "Oh, Mama's talking in her white voice." It just reminded me of that. Go ahead, Maureen.
I was just saying, I really appreciate the use of connections and those areas of privilege to help people along. One of the things that I stress a lot, because I come from a family that, a lot of the racism in my family manifested as bottom rung aversion, as Heather McGee talks about. And so I'm aware of the levels of privilege, and one of those levels being educational privilege. Every one of us in this meeting today has educational privilege. And I'm always really conscious of the way our educational privilege makes us privy to information that other people just simply don't have the exposure or the information. And so walking people along to the extent that it feels safe, I feel like is a moral duty of mine. I was wondering, Katie is also on this call, that we can't see her face. She and I are both licensed clinical social workers. And I'm wondering about, creating curricula or helping to create curricula about of how to have these conversations, because they're really important. And I spend a significant part of my younger adulthood, screaming and pounding on the kitchen table to try and, getting really frustrated with people not hearing what I had to say. And that's not how to have these conversations. They're not very effective. So, those effective conversations of, I see your humanity and here are the reasons that you like me, and here's how I'm going to join with you, and let's walk along so that we can expand our acceptance and seeing the humanity of other people is a beautiful thing. I really appreciate it. I don't know that it's always possible, or it doesn't always feel just, right? Like some people we get very frustrated with. So I find it to be a very compassionate.
Sometimes you got to raise that voice. I mean,
yes. But yelling at people doesn't change their hearts and minds. Holding them accountable does.
Yeah, like when I worked in corporate, there were times where I'll say my government name is how we used to call it. I'm Lakeisha with a capital K. You know what I'm saying? I grew up in a poor area. My mom had me at 16. My dad was like 16, 17. I have a sibling whose parent had him at 14. Like, we, statistically speaking, should still be in a realm of poverty, but I had access to education. Like, my mom made some sacrifices, so I was able to go in and kind of do things that, she even moved, bought a smaller house just so I could have access to a school so that I could have a shot at doing something. But with that information, instead of staying on that ivory tower, one thing that I have opted not to do is as much of the code switching that comes with it. I struggle with it a little bit, where I'm like, you love me as K. When I'm Lakeisha and I walk in here and I don't look like I have that level of education or that level of this, or I just look like a single mom who might, like, you can't say you love Kay and you don't love Lakeisha. Let me introduce you to the ways that, even without you realizing it, you present a certain type of bias. Like when I was working in corporate, I shared a cube with, people who were, oh, we're going on vacations to Ireland, this place, and that place. And sometimes it actually took me sharing small parts of my story where it's like, dang, I never would have thought, that would have been you or your background. It's like, yeah, so let me tell you about some of the things that maybe you fundamentally believe are true that actually do hinder the progress of the things that you say you want to see come from people. So if you want people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, you can't pull the soles out of the boots, right? My mom needed access to early childhood education. Otherwise, where was I, where was I going to go to get the stuff I needed to be able to, like, like we actually, like my mom didn't get stamps with me, but I actually had to get stamps. So what are the things that you're thinking about those people? Like I had to live off of a school refund check after I had my child and had to pump in one of the bathrooms because it was taboo to, take up any spaces anywhere else. But I still had to feed my baby and couldn't afford to not be in school because I needed the refund check. All of those things that you think and assume about those people, now that you're looking at me and you care about me because you thought I was different, let me explain to you how those things are hurtful and harmful. And actually being open, even when other people weren't as open to me, over time, that started to change the culture where we had Trump supporters that voted for Bernie Sanders and was excited about it. We had people who, maybe weren't going to join some of the business resource groups and clubs and things like that and committees that after actually hearing the shared experiences that they had with just peers that they didn't think about actually wanted to show up. But some of that we can do curriculum for because we can tactically teach people the mechanics of how to do a one-on-one. But the place that you have to start with, who are those people that are, those extroverts that love to tell those stories, that love to bring people along with them, those people that you just naturally kind of want to gravitate to. How are we teaching those people to do one-on-ones and to start to move and shape culture so that it goes into a different direction? I remember people talking to me as a young Black woman and saying, well, if you go out to the clubs and you twerk your butt cheeks and you do this and that, then that means that you aren't a respectable person and you're not educated and you're not this. But then when I look at my baby sister, and she's looking at Megan Thee Stallion, and I'm like, well, you can say that all you want to about some other ones, but that young woman actually is getting a college degree. Like some of these young women got MBAs. Like I have a homegirl that's bought her house, lives on the beach and everything else, and she goes out to the club and she turns up and is making six figures. Like we have to start to abolish what some of these social norms look like so that we can just be more open, inclusive, and understanding of people as a person and not just based on respectability markers.
Yeah, but what is it that makes people assume, like for every, say, one Black person that might be getting some government aid, there are 10 white people getting government aid?
That is correct.
That would make someone make that assumption? I never assumed to think that somebody isn't getting something or somebody isn't getting something. Whoever needs something has a right to it. That's all there is to it. I think the one thing that we've learned since this pandemic, everybody's getting something that they need, and nobody should be left out. Yep. And this government has a responsibility to make sure that its citizens are taken care of, regardless of what color they are, what their background is. So when, go ahead.
A lot of the public services that were put into place after the Great Depression, when basically, people were leveled and this myth of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps was really confronted because people were laid out. And then, a lot of these programs were dismantled, again, to bring up Heather McGhee's point, like when the civil rights movement came and swept, there were a lot of people who were convinced that if white people have to share, then we'll just dismantle them. And, she makes a really compelling point that racism has undone every public good that the US has come up with. And we tend to come up with public goods and services after periods of crisis. But then government interests and corporations will harness racism to dismantle those programs. And unity, I think, is the only way to undo that.
Well, why do you think?
And I feel like that's what made Fred Hampton so absolutely dangerous and public enemy number one, is because he said, hell, you can still not like me because I'm black after this. But as far as these resources, as far as this oppression, as far as all of these other issues, you racist person still have more in common with me on this than you have with these people over
That's exactly
here.
right. Yes.
And unity can, like, we have to, I tell people, you may not agree with my lifestyle. You may not agree. You may not like me. You may be like, I don't even rock with black women with hair that's like that. But you know what? I still need you to vote a certain kind of way, because our oppressions are tied together. If the bed you make for me is the one that will also wrap you up in as well, or the hole that you dig for me is the one that you are also likely to fall in. So until we actually create this place of understanding and then build from there, over time, I think the other relationships will come and fall into place. But sometimes I start from a place of, with new people, selfishness. Your liberation is tied to mine, whether you like it or not. Like, this thing that you say that you hate is tied to this, whether you like it or not. I go into black spaces and say, you know what, regardless of how you think you feel about immigration, their oppression and the fight for their wages is directly tied to yours. And now let's go ahead and build and talk about the ways that people have basically conned you into thinking that that is your enemy instead of your ally. And what can we do to build from here? But sometimes it's sometimes in the civil rights movement, or when we romanticize it, it's like everybody came together and did kumbaya. And it's like half of those people did not like each other most of the time. I have worked with so many people in different organizations where I'm like, fundamentally speaking, if you come in here in a church suit and undermine my work one more time, we are going to meet outside in the parking lot. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, they're still more of my ally than my enemy.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's the space that we're coming together. The issue is the thing that we have to come together on and understand that it's tied together. And I think that sometimes in America, our movements have been dismantled because we have given, let's say they'll go in and give Asian people some resources and say, you know what, you're a model minority. You're nothing like those Negroes. Or you go to the African community that comes in and say, you know what, y'all do this over here. You're nothing like those Asian people. You're nothing like those Negroes. You're nothing like those Latinx people. And doing that, it keeps people at each other instead of at the actual person or the actual people or the actual oligarchy that's running things that we actually do need to come together to fight. Because there's no reason we should have super duper billionaires and kids are literally sleeping in cages.
Why is it that, okay, we talk about a level playing field, right? But if you look at history, the only people that have not been given compensation are Black people. I mean, you have Asian Americans that were given compensation. I don't think that the compensation that were given to Native Americans was just and fair, because I think that in the end, that the white Anglo-Saxons took more than what they ever gave Native Americans, but the only ones that got nothing were Black people. So why is that? Why is it that there's still a basic belief in not accepting one group of people as full human beings? Because when you negate someone's, it's like negating their humanity, negating what their contribution, negating the reality of their situation and what was done by just avoiding giving to them their due. And I just don't think that that's fair.
Yeah.
No, it isn't fair.
I would agree. I am a fan and a proponent of reparations. Like, I don't think that there is a Black person that can tie their history and lineage back to Jim Crow, back to slavery, that should have to pay for higher education right now. That should have to pay for early childhood education. Like, when I pay for a gyno visit, I'm like, it's literally on the backs of Black women that you've learned what it is that you need to learn that started modern medicine when it comes to gynecology and women's health have not been compensated, and we still are in a maternal health crisis, and we still don't get equity in care, even though it was literally built and experimented on the backs of Black women. It's still unfair, and it still sucks. And at the same time, I have to still keep fighting on what I know that we can get. And along the way, we still have those conversations. On the way, I'm still like, and Joe Biden, I don't think we need any more studies on the impacts of economic racism and this. Like, we don't need any more studies. You need to cut the check. Like, why do you still want student loan payments from me? You know what I'm saying? Like, why is my interest rate still higher? You know what's going on, and you know what some of the things are that could be done to fix it. There's no political will to actually fix it. And there's a psychological warfare that's even happened in Black communities where that's too much. We got enough. We just need them to be okay enough to not kill us. And I'm like, the benchmark should not be just don't kill us. It should that should be a blanket standard that we're just not killing people based on their race, and that, like, that's basic.
Right.
Like, we actually need to be fighting more for what's owed and what's due, and to pull people's mindsets out of scarcity. Like, as Black people here in America, we've been taught that our history is tied to scarcity. There can't be too many Black people on that board, or they gonna start kicking us off, or it ain't gonna go right. There can't be too many Black people in this neighborhood, or it's gonna mess up the property values. You can't have too many Black people at a school. It's the HBCU; those aren't seen as good as white schools. You can't have, too many Black teachers in there because they just aren't as smart, or they aren't the highest tier. It's like there's been this scarcity that's tied to Blackness, and that's part of, honestly, why I've gotten into social justice work, is to abolish that notion that there is scarcity. Because I don't know any white guys that walk into a room and go, oh my God, there's too many white guys in here. Our property values are gonna go down. The cops are gonna come in here and start beating us. Like, that's a thing that we have, that America has tried to beat into Black people, is that there is a space of scarcity, which is why it's like, you can't have too many Latinx people in your community because then you're not going to have enough resources. You can't have too many Asian people come over here. They're going to take all the academic scholarships because they don't want to give them to Black people anyway. It's like we have to get past some of those things that have been groomed into us. And other cultures have to understand that when they come here, the American experience is not just the white experience.
Right.
And that, of course, they're going to let some groups of people go through so that they can put it up there and say, oh, look, we're not racist. We have all kinds of diversity here. And it's like, you're still racist. and you've tokenized people. But because some people are winners and losers, they have allowed that kind of thing to happen and to go on.
Hey, Katie, we can't see you, but we can hear you. What's your thought?
Yeah, I'm here. So a lot of the things that are being discussed right now, so there's a couple of layers that I'm hearing. I'm definitely hearing that instead of like diversity and inclusion conversations, we have to really be addressing things like power, privilege, and oppression, which are consistently difficult concepts for white spaces because of the level of discomfort that comes with that. So having conversations about not only how do we address this, but when is the right time to address each piece in a manner that will be heard becomes really important. One of the things that I'm hearing is that I really liked about 10 minutes ago when Kay was talking about how all of our outcomes are really bound up in each other. That is just speaking my language, because she's on the line of discussion of liberation theology, Marxist thought, and things that really change the way we view how we're all interacting in society. But those kinds of discussions have historically been framed as socialism and as something that's very dangerous to what we consider to be, quote, American democracy, right? So anytime somebody starts having those talking points, it automatically creates like an anxiety in the people who are listening because they'll pick up on some of those sort of socialist talking points. And so the way that we frame these conversations and the tools that we use in terms of language and society, a lot of that can be taught through some of the academic discussions that you all were mentioning earlier. But if you think about it, right, the previous administration really had such strong backlash on that because there was this beginning of a movement that said, hey, we're going to start talking about critical race theory, and not just in academia. We're going to start talking about it in high schools. We're going to start teaching our youth about these concepts and giving them the tools and language to dismantle all of this oppression. And the government, or that particular government administration, panicked because they saw the power that was in that and said, no, they issued a executive order that you couldn't use any of that kind of discussion. And so anytime you see, the powers that be sort of panicking over something as simple as let's teach you how to change your language and look at things in terms of power dynamics, you know that there's something there. So I think it's, the things that you were talking about are just so spot on, and they're consistently framed as dangerous because they're liberating. And I think that's where the power lies. And those are the conversations that need to be had over and over and over, is that what we're aiming for everybody is for, this true sense of liberation.
Well, what is everybody afraid of? I mean, when you come right down to it, what's the big fear? What's the big fear of equality?
That the people will have the power, and the power will be removed from the privileged few, right? The oligarchy. I was just watching Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States documentary, and from the very outset, it's been rich white men who came up with this experiment, and they have largely conspired through every period of American history to keep that power concentrated among land-owning white men, and to make sure that nobody else can be white men, but also nobody else can hold land or power in this way. And that stays true, right? Like the majority of people in power currently are white men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're afraid of sharing the power. They're afraid of being treated as they've treated other people. They're terrified of revenge, frankly. I mean,
I'll say that, yeah, they treat it like a birthright.
yes.
Like you're literally denying their future generations the right at birth to be better than my children, to be better than me.
That's right.
And that is dangerous, because what does it do with what could it possibly do to your lineage if you think that your grandchild is going to have to pay for the racist sins that you've done, even though everyone else really is just looking for equity and equality so that their kids and their future generations aren't treated like crap like they were. I do feel like, Maureen, you're right, there is a fear that retaliation is going to happen because those sins have been so egregious. And that's not just in America, that's across the world.
It's projection.
Yeah, but you see,
I've never seen anything like it. Like, it's totally projection. Like, we treat people like this, and we're absolutely certain that they will treat us the same way. And it's like, no, whiteness has a lot of sociopathology in it, right? Like, I just read a really interesting article about how whiteness is sociopathic. And I don't know that I would go that far, but I would say that whiteness looks like sociopathology in a lot of ways. And it doesn't create true sociopathology, but subscription to white supremacy culture is absolutely sociopathic. And so these are folks who believe that they're going to experience the same type of egregious human rights violations that they have perpetrated, or at least taken part in, without confrontation.
Okay, we have Ibrahim Badur with us, and he's going to join the conversation. Ibrahim Badur, why do you think old white men are afraid to give up their social privilege, or are afraid of distributing the wealth?
I think they're afraid to do so because they realize that this country is becoming more diverse overall. When you have the power, it's hard to give it up when you see others who are up and coming and who are on the rise. So I feel like they're threatened by that.
Yeah, but for example, a lot of these old guys are 70 something years old, like Donald Trump. it doesn't look like he has a real love story with his kids. I don't even know that he knows his grandkids. So what is this overall desire to maintain this wealth? People aren't going to live forever. Why not spread it out? Why not be more economically diverse? Why is there this obsession to keep everything in one place?
Well, when you look at European history and culture,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that some people get upset when I talk about this, but I'm like, well, I went through an American school system and you shoved your history down my throat. So now I can't help but throw it back at you. When you look at, stories about the African diaspora, even though there was slavery, there were a lot of other things that happened, like culturally across the world. There was a lot of ridiculousness that happened. There was really no perfect culture where
Mm-hmm.
like through history. But when you look at European culture specifically, there was always like wars over the scarcity of resources, where I think that when you look at in Africa, there was an abundance of land, sun, everything was, it's like a kiss of the motherland. They loved earth. When you talk about indigenous folks here and the resources that they had, it was like you could war over some things. However, you really didn't need to, because you had the resources that you needed. You loved the land, you cultivated the space. But in European history, there was always like this scarcity, this war with man versus nature versus each other versus this, that it's like they've had so many generations of that through European culture. It's gonna take time to unlearn that level of like
trauma. It's a trauma response
that's in your DNA. Like my grandmother experienced trauma around racism, and I still hold that in my body today. Like it's literally in the eggs of our babies. It's certain traumas are passed down genetically to our children. We've been doing, which is why in some cultures it's like, let's just do equity. You got your stuff over here. We just want to be left alone with the stuff that we have over here. But then you have others that culturally, that is not how that works. And I think when we look at European culture, that is not how that works. It's rooted in war, famine, like illness, disease. And it's just, when you look at it, there were some beautiful moments, but it was actually really tumultuous in comparison to other areas. And in those places, I think that we see that culture show up here, because if we're being honest, Europe didn't say we're going to pack up and send our best. So when people went to Africa to pick up folks, you know what I'm saying? They didn't go and say, oh yeah, we want your sickest, we want your most this. No, we need your engineers, we need your farmers, we need your architects. Like they were enslaving some of the best folk they could get, that were physically and mentally sharp and strong to be able to do the things they did not know how to do. However, when Europe sends over people, they were not sending over what they would consider their best. And I think that has been a complex that has played out in America for quite some time that we don't talk about.
Right. That's right.
So Ibrahim, do you think you, as a man of color, will ever have the same opportunity to have the same power that a white man has in this country in your lifetime?
No, I don't think so.
Why not? So what's the struggle for?
I don't think so, because I don't feel as if people of color have been presented the same opportunities just growing up, and it depends on what kind of background you come from. If you're coming from an educated background, there's always going to be more opportunity there, right? But historically, people of color aren't coming from the most from very well educated backgrounds, especially in this country. And it goes back generation upon generation upon generation.
But you have an education.
I do have an education.
Yeah. So do you think you'll have that opportunity with your education, or is it just that line draws the color? I mean, that line, that your color defines where you can go and where you can't go.
I do feel that up to a certain extent. I feel like if there's somebody who has the same level of, the same skill set, the same education, and it's me versus a gentleman who's white, I feel like the gentleman who's white is gonna win out every single time.
So how does a person of color overcome? How does a person of color find their fulfillment in this day and time?
You have to be
Because
10 times better. You have to be 10 times better. You have to go above and beyond every single time with anything you do to even be considered on the same level playing field. And if you're not, then you're going to get thrown in the dirt time and time again.
see, Maureen, that to me is trauma. That to me is traumatic.
Yeah, absolutely. Racism is traumatic. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there have been really fantastic authors who've made really important points about that. I think we can make the case that hurt people. I think to Kay's point, there are a lot of folks that came from Europe who were really injured, and it's taken them generations to work it out. And there's still this scarcity, zero-sum thinking that is very much the hallmark of trauma. But we have to...
Every day you get up. Every day you go to sleep. You wake up in the morning. You're still living in this environment. You're still being reminded when you turn on the television and you see someone has been shot by a police officer, or someone is on trial for a crime he didn't commit, or someone's family is forced to go on welfare when they have the academic background, and it is traumatic and it is depressing. How does one get above that? I mean, Katie, you do the same thing. You have the same educational background as Maureen. In your opinion, how does someone get past that? Katie?
I think that is a huge question that cannot be answered in something as simple as like, here's how you do it, right? Because it depends a lot on the way somebody's processing trauma, the type of past trauma they've had in their own lives, as well as intergenerational trauma, and how that's affected them epigenetically, as Kay mentioned, or emotionally, psychologically. I don't think I have an answer that says this is one way that we could do that. I wish there was an answer. If there were any clinician who had that answer, I think a profession in our life would look a whole lot different, but it's not something you can just say, here, go heal.
So you can't get it out of Prozac Nation, huh?
Generally speaking, I think that trauma is healed in relationships and in emotionally corrective experiences. So unity, tying our futures together, communication, dialoguing, helping people with emotionally corrective experiences, I think is the way trauma is healed. But it takes a while, and it's not always possible in one moment or in one relationship.
Well, see, in my experience, I'm not being biased, I find that Black people do not mind sitting next to someone else. Sometimes other people mind sitting next to Black people. Black people tend to be find it easy to embrace others. I don't know what Kay feels. I don't know what Ibrahim feels, but that's my experience. Do you two see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I think especially when you talk about Black Americans, and that's, well, one, I'll say this: you can have anybody of any culture where you have some people who are just bad, crappy people, and I think that sometimes when we talk about certain things, people take it as, oh, but that means that all of them are good people. I'm like, I've met some Black people, and if I could lay hands on them, I absolutely would to get them nerves. I don't like them. But I will say that as a Black person, we are more likely to understand, especially as Black Americans, like the trauma that comes from just existing and all the ways that can come up, which is why in looking at the hurt that I've seen come from Asian communities, I feel that in my soul. Yeah. And then to add on top of that, the fact that you thought that you could model minority your way into whiteness, and to find out that you always are going to be a step above, like you're always going to be just that much of a step above where you thought I was. Like there is, it's just like that you can go from being model minority to disease spreaders and this and everything else, because the issue is white supremacy. So it's like, I feel that. And I think that sometimes other cultures can also exploit that in a way that I feel you at my intersection, but I'm never really going to dig deep to understand how does that feel to have an entire existence where I can't even trace my lineage back to Africa, where other people can have cultural things about their lineage that they're proud of, that they can trace back. I can't even do like even that part. My history was robbed from me. Imagine how that feels as a people to have no home, versus when somebody said, well, you can always go back to this place, you can always go back to that place. With me, where the hell am I going to go back to? Like all of that has been robbed. And that feeling of constantly being lost or out of place or constantly being treated as another, and to know that no matter where you go, you'll always be an other, that's something that is unique to the Black American experience that I think sometimes gets exploited, where it's like this horrible thing happened. Where are the Black people to come and like fight for us? Where is the Stacey Abrams to come and save us? You know, like when the molester was, what was it, Alabama, where they had a pedophile or a molester that Republicans like almost got elected. And it was Black women that were hitting the streets and mobilizing voters, and everybody collectively across the country said, oh, thank God for these Black women for saving us for ourselves again. And it's like, okay, well, when does everybody else think to come in and save us? Because we got a Black maternal health crisis. Our babies are being locked up in prison. Our babies are being pipelined and stuff. We're not getting fair wages. Like, we're constantly being exploited for the things that we do have. Every time we get something as Black Americans in this country, there's typically been a troop of white people that's come in and burn it down. We talk about Tulsa. We talk about reparations for even what happened in Wilmington, where those Black people never got their land back. They never got their resources back. You talk like 100, 150 years ago, and that still hasn't been made amends on. You talk about the gentrification that happens here in Guilford County all the time, where they're taking people's houses through code enforcement, not making amends for any of that. Yet every election cycle is Donald Trump, is a pedophile, it's somebody else. It's like, oh, thank God these Black people came in to help save us for ourselves, specifically Black women, because we vote in the highest loyal percentages. And it's just like at a certain point, where I'm hoping we can get multiracial work, is that it's not just the, oh, thank God the mammy is here to save us. It's all of us collectively looking and reflecting on learning how to show up for Black people, Black women, Black femmes, those that we've relied on for so long to be the heartbeat and the pulse of this country. Like, when do we actually learn to show up specifically for those people? It's like, once we learn, I honestly feel that once we learn how to show up for the Black woman and femme in this country, once we learn how to show up for that, a lot of these other issues will start to correct themselves. Because at almost every turn, Black women have been like the least. And when we talk to them about Latinx women, the darker the hue, you talking about Black, like we still separate that. But at the crux of it, the Black woman has been some of the most disrespected across this world, but yet has been called on to do absolutely so much. So I think that as we learn how to handle that and deal with that, we'll get somewhere. So when we look at labor and the fight for labor here in this country, where white women then entered the workforce, and now it's like, oh my God, I'm getting sexually harassed at work. Oh my God, our wages aren't matching. Oh my God, I'm like, name a time in American history that Black women have not been working.
Exactly.
You know, and it's like, had we learned how to treat Black women in those working experiences, then we wouldn't have even had to fight for a whole suffrage movement and women's labor movement, had we just learned how to treat Black women the way that they should have been treated in the beginning. And trying to break the Black men. Black women were groomed to treat their sons as treat them mentally weak so that they are not a threat, but keep them physically strong so that white men and white people see value in them and will not harm them or toss them to the side. Like, we have to talk about how those attacks and how those things have come and shown up and how they've had terrible impacts for literally everybody else across this country. So once we learn how to show up and do that, maybe some of these other issues that we have will start to correct themselves.
Exactly. That's and I'm just gonna say it, the Me Too movement, seriously, I kind of thought the Me Who movement, because it's like when a certain class and a certain group of people begin to feel those abuses, that's when that movement took off. Well, that was from the very beginning when the first slave women were brought here. That never stopped. And so all of a sudden, it took on motion. And to me, it was, even though there was a need to have that recognized, the fact that it went unrecognized for so long was offensive. So long, it was offensive. But when a certain class of women, when it happened to them, it was acknowledged and it took off, boom.
Yeah.
What was going on with that?
Yeah. And then like a collective thing where when I looked at Donald Trump's candidacy, I was like, if you can grab a rich white married woman by the vagina and there be no consequences or ramifications for it, not even from white women, I was like, okay, so what you thought about this country, or what some people thought, I'll say white progressives specifically, what they thought and where they thought we were, I think that was one of the most eye-opening experiences for everybody else, at the level of, one, white men have privilege, right? And they utilize that through this country's exception, but white women have benefited from that greatly.
Mm-hmm.
And if it came down to, I'm going to stand in unity with Black women, Black men, Latinx folks, Hispanic folks, Asian folks, or I'm going to keep riding off this privilege, we had a large number of white women that still voted for that man and still feel some kind of loyalty to that and to the systems that support that and hold that up.
Yeah. Yeah. Ibrahim, I'm sorry, Ibrahim, if you put your hands on a white woman, or even if you were accused, do you think you would have been treated by the justice system the same way as Donald Trump?
Of course not.
What do you think? What do you foresee? What do you think would have happened to you?
I mean, it's just like in any other situation where, you have any kind of crime. We could take it to the extremes of any type of mass shooting, if it's done, I forgot his name. But one of the gentlemen who was involved in a mass shooting, I believe he was taken to Pizza Hut after he got arrested by the cops.
Yeah.
That would never happen, to anybody, with a different skin color, He
was allowed his cell phone while he was inside the cell.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
For anybody else, they're either going to get beaten up or shot or killed on the spot. And
right.
And that's the way. And, these things are, you see these things and subconsciously your brain almost agrees with it because that's what you've been brought up seeing. You see it in movies, you see it on TV, and you see it everywhere because, we say one thing in this country, we speak about democracy and we speak about all these different types of things, but what we see on the news is really divide and conquer. It's a system that's set up to have everybody against each other. So we forget about what we really should be arguing about, which is, equality and on the most basic level. And that doesn't happen. Like I said, everything is reinforced through television, movies, and what we see in front of our eyes, and subconsciously that you build upon that, and then it speaks itself into reality when you see it happening in real life. So you're not surprised by it.
Well, I was surprised about the guy that actually traveled all those miles and went to what's it called, Kenosha?
Mm-hmm.
And he shot and killed 2 people, and he's actually out on bond. He is actually out on bond. Hasn't been tried or convicted. And with the help of the last administration, he is out on bond. And I would be surprised if he was convicted. And it shocks me because there's no way that a man of color could get away with something like that. And it shows you the inequality of the justice system. In fact, the man who killed George Floyd, he had decided to take a plea deal, and what's his name? William Barr intervened. He was convinced not to take the plea deal. And that's why we are seeing the trial right now. It just shows you, power has serves the purpose. Maureen?
I got nothing for you on that one. Yeah, that's accurate. Power serves privilege.
So we're going to wind up today. And I want to thank everybody for participating. And I hope that we will be able to continue this conversation soon. I appreciate what you two have contributed. It's been really interesting and there's so much more to say. And I hope we're going to get to that, especially as this year progresses on. There'll be a lot more to be said. I really enjoyed this conversation. I thank you. So you all take care. We hope to see our audience back next week for God Squad. And it was good seeing you all. Thanks.